Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the Mind Muscle Connection podcast. Today is a solo episode and I have a topic I want to dive into, and that's going to be around different fat loss strategies and how we can utilize them to help you lose body fat. And by the end of this, my goal is that you understand different ways that you can lose body fat through different strategies. And then we'll briefly touch on some just common diets and how they may work, right? And again, at the end of this, you should have an understanding of, hey, why certain diets would work and why maybe certain ones wouldn't, and why certain strategies may not work or why you may struggle with that. Let's dive into it real quick. One thing, I am not on 2 shots of espresso today, but this should still be a good episode. All right, so I think anytime we start with this different fat loss strategies, I need to first go into understanding fat loss. How do we actually lose body fat? Okay. And again, this is going to come down to energy balance. So this is where you've heard calories in, calories out, calorie deficit, whatever it may be. And so I'm going to briefly go over this because, again, I think it's important to do that. And again, maybe I still would listen just because I feel like the more you hear it, the more it gets ingrained there. So real quick, energy balance. So we have our total daily energy expenditure, and then we have calories that we bring in. Okay. So totally daily energy expenditure is going to be made up of 4 key things here. It's going to be your resting metabolic rate. So that's, again, the amount of calories you burn at rest, just with basic bodily functions. Okay. And that's going to make up a huge portion of how many calories you burn in a day. Then we also have NEAT, non-exercise activity thermogenesis. This is variable from person to person, but this is going to be subconscious movement. You could lump steps in there. You may not. Again, it just depends, but just think of it as extra movement that's not dedicated exercise, right? Me sitting here talking, fidgeting, blinking, that's going to burn some calories. Again, some people, this is going to range from person to person, right? Then we have thermic effect of food. So this is how many calories you burn absorbing and digesting food. Each macronutrient is going to differ in terms of that. Protein is going to be the highest one. So again, the amount of food that you eat can impact this. And then we have exercise activity. And again, this is going to range from person to person, what they do. And this is the amount of calories you burn from dedicated exercise. What I commonly see is when people think of how many calories they burn, they'll go off their watch or whatever it says, or how many calories they burn in their workout. And they're like, that's what I burn in a day, right? So they think, oh, hey, I burn 800 calories, or they try to burn as many as they can, not really doing anything from a fat loss perspective. And because they think that's all the calories they burn. But again, we have these 3 other components that are going to make up a large amount of how many calories you burn in a day. So that's energy balance. Okay. And then obviously calories in is essentially all the calories that you absorb and your body utilizes the calories from it. Pretty straightforward. Again, there may be some instances where if you have really bad gut issues, you may not be absorbing all the calories, all the nutrients from the calories in. And then in some very rare instances, some people may absorb more calories, right? Again, I don't know too much about that, but just understand those are the extremes. That's not going to be you, but just understand that in certain situations that could potentially be the case there. But again, generally speaking, this one's simple. It's just the calories you bring in. Okay. And so when we expend more calories than we bring in, we're going to be in an energy deficit. When we are neutral, that means we're at energy balance. And then when we consume more calories than what we expend, we're in a calorie surplus, right? And so again, in order to lose body fat, we need to be in a energy deficit, right? We need to be expending more energy than we bring in. And so again, you can see where we manipulate this in terms of the calories that we eat, but also we can manipulate it via the types of foods we eat with thermic effect of food. We can affect it with subconscious movement. Again, some stuff you're not really going to be able to, how much you fidget. Again, you could try and do that, but again, that's really going to be genetic. You can move more, right? That's going to help you. And then you could exercise a bit more, right? And so these are the levers that we have to pull in order to get into a calorie deficit. Now, one thing I want to throw into this, and this is where people, I guess, where calories in, calories out can potentially go sideways, and where people maybe say, oh, that's not true because I did this, right? It is dynamic. And so what that means is what you do on the input side of things. So the amount of calories you're eating, what you eat can impact the energy outside of things. And there are certain things that can impact the energy outside of things that sometimes we may not. So again, like hormones, thyroid, medications, things like that can impact the energy outside of things as well too. It can lower it. For some things could potentially increase it. But again, anytime we increase that, usually our hunger is going to go up. So then we can easily subconsciously eat more. And then if we consume less food, again, that's going to impact the energy outside of things where it may trend down. And then when that's down, our body may compensate a bit more, right? It just depends on the person. So it is very dynamic. But at the end of the day, in order to lose body fat, you need to be in a calorie deficit. Now, again, things are going to change and it's dynamic. So it's not as straightforward as, hey, I typically eat 2,000 calories. That maintains my weight. I go to 1,600. That's going to put me in a deficit. Again, it's dynamic. It could be a little bit lower than that. It may be a little bit higher than that. You don't know. And so that's where you have to look at feedback here and track to see if you actually are. And I'll go over what that looks like. But again, a lot of people forget that that's going to impact it. So again, what do I mean by that? So again, if we bring in less food, that's going to impact the energy outside of things because now you're consuming less food. So you may be using less from a thermic effect of food. Sometimes when we consume less food and we're in an energy deficit, our bodies will move less. So then that's going to lower that over time, potentially, right? And then again, the longer we're in a deficit, sometimes things like your hormones can not get out of whack. They may adapt to that. And so that's going to lower your total daily energy expenditure potentially, right? So there's a lot of things at play here that can impact that. And so this is why at the end of the day, the best way to know if you're in a calorie deficit is looking at your body weight, taking averages for the week and seeing where that's trending over time. Okay. The best way to do it. And within that, you should be looking at your measurements and your progress pictures because again, maybe you are someone who doesn't have a lot of muscle. And so for you, a negative energy balance and you're doing things right, like you could potentially be gaining a little bit of muscle and that's going to offset some of that weight loss potentially. Again, I don't ever think it's going to be 1-to-1, unfortunately. It's just really hard. Like muscle's really slow process and tough to do. Fat loss generally is going to be a little bit quicker in terms of that. But this is why we need to look at that. So this is when people say, well, you need to be losing weight, like that. This is why, right? Because if we're losing weight, that means we're in a negative energy balance and that energy, that deficit is going to need to be made up somewhere. And if we're doing things right, that energy deficit will be made up through dropping body fat. Now, we could be losing weight. And if we're not eating enough protein, we're not resistance training, we could lose some of that from muscle. We could burn some of it off as muscle. As Kyle Baxter likes to say, he said, muscle is not lost. It is just burned, which again is true and makes sense. That episode, I don't know if by the time I'm making this, if it will be out. I think it will be. I think it should already been out on Wednesday. So it should be the previous episode. Actually, it's going to be out next week. Sorry, I lied. It's going to be next week because Jenkins was the last one. Anyways. So again, that's the kind of interplay here. Again, just to sum this up, I went over what energy balance is. So again, if you hear calories in, calories out, you should have a better understanding and just understand that where most people say calories in, calories out doesn't work is simply just because they don't understand it's dynamic and it changes based on the inputs that you send to your body, right? Again, whether that be through movements, whether that be through how much food you eat, whether that be through medications, all these things are going to impact it and make it a dynamic thing. So again, the best way to know if you're in an energy deficit is where your weight's trending over time. If it's not trending down and or your measurements and progress pictures are not improving, you're not in an energy deficit over time. There's somewhere along the lines where you're either your body's compensating a bit or really where most people screw up is they just consume more calories than they think, right? Hey, they're on track for 5 days out of the week. They track low calorie. And then over the weekend, like I said, when we're one thing that can happen when we're in a deficit is hunger ramps up, right? So again, you can start to see where your inputs can impact this. So your hunger goes up, then you have a meal or two where you're not tracking and you don't understand that your body's going to be hungrier and it's going to be easy to overeat. Even if you do everything you can, it's still going to be a challenge to do that. So then you consume more calories, right? Then you're at maintenance for over time, right? You're not actually allowing yourself to get into a deficit for time that we need to. Maybe in a short-term deficit, but unfortunately that's not going to be, that could be enough to increase your hunger, but it's not going to be enough to actually lose tissue, depending on what you do the rest of the time there. Or it just slows down a lot, right? Where it's like, hey, I'm dieting. I'm only losing like 0.2 pounds a week. There's some pros and cons to that. But again, just understand that if you're not dropping body weight, you're not in an energy deficit. And hopefully, again, now you know that it's dynamic and there's certain things at play here that can impact it. All right, so next I want to go over the role of exercise and nutrition in this process. So if you listen to my last solo episode, I talked about diet and exercise, what's more important for health and body comp on there. So you should have an understanding, but I just want to briefly go over it. So what's exercise's role in all this? Again, exercise, as we talked about, is going to help burn calories. If we resistance train, it's going to help make sure that we keep muscle and potentially add it. And it's just going to help improve our overall metabolic health, right? Like exercise and movement is going to improve that, right? You're going to be, your body's, it's going to allow your body to use the nutrients that you give it much better, right? It's going to send it to the right places, right? You're going to use it in muscle and things like that. And you're actually going to use that there. Again, it can help with muscle retention during a deficit. And again, exercise, dedicated exercise can enhance our deficit. But what we don't want to do is we don't want to make it the primary focus. Again, if you want to hear a deeper dive into this on my last solo episode, I went over this. But again, it should not be the primary focus. You can do it that way, but it's going to be very challenging. As I said earlier, when we ramp up exercise, and that gets us into a deficit, which again, you have to do a lot to do that. It's not like you can just go and have one workout where you burn 1,000 calories and that's going to get, like, you need to do a lot of exercise in order to do that. And again, I think once we start trying to do that as our main goal, we also don't put our body in a great spot to keep muscle, right? When our sole focus is, hey, I'm just going to do a ton of exercise to burn calories. But again, when we do that, that can raise a deficit. And again, in the short term, like I said, long term, you need to be in a deficit. Like for multiple weeks on end to really see fat loss, you need to be in a deficit for multiple weeks on end, not just 3 days out of the week and then the rest you're not. That's going to ramp up your hunger. So then you're going to subconsciously eat more if you're not tracking your nutrition, right? So again, you can see, and then that's just a tough thing to do to keep that up. It's just that's going to lead to higher burnout and more likely to just be like, I can't sustain this, right? If we just focus on exercise to get our deficit. So again, this is where nutrition plays a role. It's going to be much easier to control our intake if we have some full focus on our nutrition, okay? It's just super easy to, like I said in that last example, if we're not focused on our nutrition in that process, it's going to be easy to overeat, right? If you just try to exercise a ton, be like, you know what, I'm just going to exercise my way to it. Again, that may work in the short term, but over multiple weeks on end, that's going to be a very tough process to maintain. And it's just super easy to eat 2,000 calories. Whereas in order to burn 2,000 calories, which again, we know that's not the only calories you burn in a day, you have to do a lot more work than that. So again, nutrition has to be something that if we want to lose body fat, we have to have some focus on nutrition. Now, we should understand what energy balance is, how we actually lose body fat, and the role of exercise and nutrition in that process. Now, let's talk about the exact strategies that we can use. So again, in order to lose body fat, we need to be in a calorie deficit. But again, this isn't hey, you need to be in a deficit for 3 days out of the week. You need to, or 1 week, like you'll maybe lose a little bit, but if you don't sustain that deficit over multiple weeks on end, you're not going to drop body fat. Okay. So at the end of the day, any fat loss that we're going to do needs to get us into a negative energy balance over multiple weeks on end. As I talked about, when we're in a negative energy balance, hunger is going to rise. Like your total daily energy expenditure may decrease for an energy deficit for a while. The more fat we lose in general, again, things start to adapt a little bit. So it can just be very challenging. And then in today's modern environment where there's abundance of calorie dense foods and just leads to sedentariness, it's really hard to sustain a calorie deficit for multiple weeks on end. But in order to actually lose body fat, we have to do that. You can't just do 2 weeks and then be done. And that's, again, where most people, when I'm checking in with clients, I always tell them, hey, this is great. And especially for clients that have struggled to stay consistent. I'm like, hey, you had a great week. You've had a good couple weeks. Here's the thing. This is a good start, but just understand that this is the time when most people take their foot off the gas pedal, right? Oh, I've been doing pretty good. I'm going to let this kind of come back in. Oh, I'm going to let this come back in. You start to make these small choices and then, or you just don't at all, and there's everything in between. And that's really where, again, if you can sustain this for multiple weeks on end, that's where you're really going to see fat loss. Again, it's these short-term things, these really drastic approaches that don't work because people can't sustain it a long-term. Again, I do think there's a benefit of aggressive dieting and you don't have to be like super slow with it because there are some pros and cons to that. But again, very drastic measures usually don't work. Again, they work in the short term, but not in the long term to actually see you lose a good amount of body fat. You may lose a little bit, but not enough to like actually change the way you look. And that's where people get themselves stuck. So let's talk about strategies to create a deficit. So there's 3 main ways, right? Now, I want to attribute this to Peter Attia because this is something I read in his book Outlive, and he talks about it. We're going to go a little bit deeper than this, but again, if we think about it fundamentally, there's 3 ways that we can create a deficit. One, we can cut out a food group or certain foods. Okay. So by reducing like carbs, fats, or processed foods, this can cut calories. So again, you could do something where it's like, hey, I'm not going to eat any carbs. And that can be a way to get you into a calorie deficit because you're cutting out a big chunk of foods, right? And a lot of times when people think carbs, they're thinking the more processed type foods. When you do that, you're certainly going to cut calories. Or again, maybe it's, hey, I'm not going to have any processed foods, or I'm not going to have X food, or I'm not going to have any sweets, or whatever it may be, right? You're cutting out a food group that's adding a lot of calories, calorie dense type foods, right? No one's ever going to try to lose body fat and be like, you know what, I'm going to cut out all veggies, all fruit, all lean proteins. No, people aren't going to do that. They're going to cut out pizzas, ice cream, again, very calorie dense stuff. And alcohol, whatever, again, that's another one. When you do that, and let's say you cut out alcohol, and now you're not consuming all those calories from that, but then you're also not having that late night eating anymore. You're also not waking up the next day, not feeling great, and then wanting to consume more calories. So again, you can see where this is a way to get you to drop body fat and get into a calorie deficit because you're cutting out a lot of those foods. A lot of times people will cut out those foods. Again, now because they're doing that, they're focusing on more nutrient dense, high volume type foods, and they feel like they're eating a lot more food and they're consuming less calories. And this again comes back to where people are like, I checked my calories and it didn't work. But usually when people track their calories, they're trying to fit in as much tasty food as possible. So they do that. And then next thing, you're undershooting calories because you're not ever full. And then you stop tracking and it leads to more calories being consumed, where you cut out some of these highly processed, high calorie dense type foods, you're going to naturally decrease your overall energy that you're bringing in, right? So again, that's one method. Another method that you could do, or in combination, is cut out a time of day to eat. This is a time restricted eating, intermittent fasting, whatever you want to call it. Again, if we're cutting out a time of day, it's time restricted eating. But this is going to limit eating windows. And so again, this can lead to fewer calories being consumed. In the research, when they cut out periods of time and they just let people eat as they are, the people that cut out a time to eat end up losing more weight. So again, if we're cutting out a period of time to eat, you're probably going to eat less calories because of that, which in turn can lead you to being into an energy deficit. Now, same thing, let's go back to the first one. Same thing here. That's a strategy to do it. But again, you could also still overconsume calories if you're not tracking what you're doing. You can still overeat healthy foods. Same thing with cutting out time of day. It could be a way to help you eat less, but it could still cause you to eat more depending on the person. Again, it may not work for you because, again, you still need to be in a calorie deficit, but it can be a way to help you get into a calorie deficit without having to track all your calories. And ideally, if you're going to implement this, the best time to do it's going to be, hey, you don't eat after 5 p.m. or 4 p.m. versus, oh, hey, I'm not going to eat till 12, just because generally that's not going to be as good. It's just going to be tougher. It's not that it's not better or worse from a weight loss perspective. It's just going to be tougher for you. This goes in line with our natural circadian rhythms as well too. So again, we can cut out time of day. What that looks like is it could be a fast where you fast for 20 hours. It could be a fast for 16 hours. It could be a fast for 18, whatever it is, whatever would work for you is what we'd want to do. Now, what I will say from a body composition standpoint, I wouldn't go any less than 6 hours in terms of your eating window. Just because, again, from a lean body mass perspective, I think if we go anything less than that, it's going to be hard to get in the amount of protein that we need. And it's going to be really hard to get your training in within that too. Again, you could put it before or after. Again, you'd probably do your training before, but again, that's going to impact your training performance there. So we cut out the time of day. Third is just daily calorie restriction, right? So this is you track your calories. So you track everything that you eat. And again, you can use your body weight in combination, and you can use that to get you into a calorie deficit. Now, that's a little bit more work that you have to do through tracking. Tracking is not a perfect science. It's easy to underestimate how much you're consuming, and it's time consuming, and you need to find the amount that you need to be at as well, right? Some people will either really undershoot or they'll overshoot the amount that they need. Because again, to come back to the energy balance that I talked about initially, it is very dependent on, it's genetic, right? Some people are going to be able to, again, body weight's definitely going to be something where higher your body weight is, you're probably going to have a higher total daily energy expenditure within reason. When you become obese, again, that may be out of whack a little bit and may not line up as perfectly there. But there is a big genetic component to it, but body size is definitely a big thing there. So again, there's daily calorie restriction in terms of tracking your calories. And so again, if we look at every diet out there, it probably does at least one of these three things. It either cuts out a certain food, cuts out the time of day you're eating, or you're tracking your calories, some form of tracking that. And again, you could think like Weight Watchers for that, or again, just macro tracking if it fits your macros. And each one's going to have its pro and con. I think, again, you can combine certain ones. If you think about it, most people are probably going to do a combination of either like cutting out a food, not cutting it out, but at least reducing certain foods, and then calorie restriction. That's usually where people are going to be at. And when I have clients come to me, we're usually doing, I like to have them track their calories and macros because it just teaches you a little bit more. But there's certain scenarios where, again, maybe we do more of a meal plan, or we do one of the other options, or again, you do it in combination there. All right. So those are our main ones. From there, within that, we have some other strategies that we can utilize as well too. Okay, so you can use hand portions. So hand portions would be one where, again, that's just a form of tracking, but you don't necessarily have to weigh and measure everything out. You can just use your hands there, and that can be a simple way to quantify how much you're eating. And with that, again, you would just quantify what you're eating and then compare that to where your weight's trending, and then from there you make some adjustments. Maybe you need to have a little bit more nutrient dense foods. Maybe you need to, instead of 2 cupped hands of carbs, you need to do 1. Again, that's a simple way to put some sort of metric to what we're doing and have some sort of number there, we can quantify it. So then from there, again, we have calorie tracking, but then we also have daily calorie restriction. Okay. And this is going to be, you're consistently in a moderate deficit, right? So you're tracking calories or whatever it may be, and you're just consistently dropping weight and you're just in a deficit for X amount of weeks. Okay. That's one way you can do it. You can just go straight through. Again, the pro of that is you could probably have your calories be a little bit higher on any given or throughout the week, because we're looking for that long-term deficit. So again, that is one way to go about it. Another way is calorie cycling. Again, there's different versions of this. You have a 5-2 diet. You could lump intermittent fasting into this, where you have 1 or 2 days where you don't eat, whatever it may be, alternate day fasting, right? But we're doing some form of calorie cycling. So this is higher calorie days on, say, training days, and then lower on rest days. Okay. So some form of calorie cycling. You don't have to be in a deficit. You could have, again, 1 day where you're a little bit higher, 2 days where you're a little bit higher, but the trade-off with that is those other days that you are in a deficit, they're going to have to be a little bit lower. Anytime you have, the more higher days you have, the lower your low days are going to have to be there. I'll talk about some specific strategies within this that you can use. But again, we can do some form of calorie cycling. Now, the key with this is you need to watch what you do on your higher days. You probably don't want to be in a surplus. So you need to find a good maintenance range for you, because that's going to be the key. What I find is people subconsciously do calorie cycling. If maybe their goal is daily calorie restriction, but they subconsciously do calorie cycling, where they'll have a couple days where they're a bit higher. But the issue with that is they're uncontrolled days, and they end up being like surpluses. And so that increases your overall caloric intake for the week, and you end up being closer to maintenance. And so you could see from a psychological standpoint, the difference between, hey, we have a planned day of higher calories, again, around your maintenance. You're on the plan. So you're feeling good. You know that what you're doing is working, where you have the other side of it, where it's like you have 3 or 4 days where you are trying to be in a calorie deficit, but you're trying to do it every single day. And then the days you don't hit your plan, then mentally it's like, now it's frustrating because you're working hard and things aren't going anywhere with that, right? So again, people do this subconsciously without really realizing it. So I like to have it planned because it helps with this psychological side of things. Again, there's pros and cons of this approach. You're doing different stuff, different days. You could be on your days where you're a little bit higher calorie. It could be harder to moderate your food intake, but the pros are it gives you some days where you can consume a little bit more calories. Mentally, it can be helpful. But again, if it works or not, it just really depends on the client. But again, we can use something like calorie cycling. And I'll go into this when I talk about aggressive dieting, but another form of this would be like a protein sparing modified fast. Again, there's a couple ways that you could do it, where you could do a protein sparing modified fast for a week or 2 at a time, or you could do 2 or 3 days doing protein sparing modified fast, and then the rest of the days you're closer to maintenance, right? Again, like I said, that's a form of calorie cycling, where maybe you have more higher days, but that means your low days are going to have to be pretty low. So again, it's figuring out what works for you. And then the last strategy that we can implement here. And so real quick with that, again, you could see where mentally, if you do that and you stick with it, you can have a couple days where you're eating more calories. And so again, for some people, that can allow them to stay in an energy deficit for extended periods of time because they don't feel like they need to be restricted every single day. Then we have diet breaks and refeeds. Again, these are just another kind of form of calorie cycling. But again, these are temporary increases in calories to offset metabolic adaptation a little bit, but also to maintain adherence. So I have a client right now who he came to me, he wanted to do an approach of 3 weeks of a push and then 1 week where he's at maintenance, right? And for him, this has been super helpful because it allows him to stay focused in those 3 weeks, and then he can have a week where he increases his calories a bit. And what's cool with this too is we're able to also set it up with this training to where we can really push his training in that 1 week and like ramp up volume and intensity to where he can really push his training. So that's a great kind of strategy there. And so far he's on his second cycle of this and he loves it. And he's been seeing things trend down. He's someone that he went from 220 down to about 185, 180-ish. And he did that through doing phases of fat loss, phases of maintenance. That wasn't just straight through. But now he's at the point where he's at a little bit of a sticking point here around 180. Again, the further we get from where we came from, the tougher it's going to be to continue to lose more weight. And so you may have to utilize some of these things to break through that plateau there. So he's an example of somebody that's using it. Again, diet breaks and refeed. So refeed is, again, essentially a form of calorie cycling. I've talked a lot about refeed, so you guys should be familiar with them now. On my last Q&A, I talked about them in more detail, so just go back and check out that episode. But essentially, it's just a day at maintenance calories. It can be proactive, it can be reactive. Proactive being, hey, you're going to have it planned in. So again, a form of calorie cycling. And then, or it can be reactive where, again, it's, hey, I'm feeling like super fatigued. I just mentally need a day to eat a few more calories. Boom, we can throw it in. But again, the key is maintenance. And they're going to be better for women and the leaner you are in general. And then we could do diet breaks. And saying that with refeed, you can still utilize them for other people, but just understand that they're best for them. And you can do as many as you want, but just understand the more you're at maintenance, it's going to slow down fat loss. If you had someone that went straight through versus someone that took diet breaks, it would just be a little bit slower there, right? But you could still get to the same point. And again, a lot of times people, by implementing these things, can stick to it longer, which ultimately is the most important thing. And then we have diet breaks. These are weeks, a week or longer at maintenance, right? So, okay, I've been pushing hard for 8 weeks. You know what? If I take a week at maintenance, just take some stress off of dieting, mentally I'm refreshed and now I'm ready to go again for another 8 weeks. Again, that's a strategy that you can utilize there. So these are all examples of strategies to get us into a calorie deficit. Some of them are short-term and then some of them help you long-term. But the big takeaways, you need to sustain a caloric deficit for extended periods of time. And all these can be strategies that we can use to help get us into that energy deficit. A couple things I want to finish up here with are aggressive dieting strategies. And then I can also talk about a few popular diets now, and we can talk about why they work. But aggressive dieting, again, one that I really like is protein sparing modified fast. So again, this is like 1 to 2 days per week or weeks at a time where you would utilize diet breaks. Okay. So you could do 1 to 2 days where you're doing a protein sparing modified fast. It's essentially like 500 to 1,000 calories of really just protein, maybe some veggie. Big thing here is you want to make sure you get some form of multivitamin or micronutrition into your diet. But again, this can be a way to get you into a deficit, have times, whether that be throughout the week or again, like over a month's time span, more time at maintenance there. And again, it can also just help you like push through and can create a good sized deficit. Again, it comes with its pros and cons. Obviously, you want to make sure you get enough protein, and then you probably will have to alter your training, especially during the days or weeks where you're really low calorie. You're gonna have to do less volume, less intensity, most likely less volume, but potentially less intensity, which you want to be careful with that. Women in general have a larger stress response to deficit. So we want to be careful with any of these strategies for women in terms of aggressive dieting and any of these strategies. So again, using calorie cycling, like really low days, again, you'd want to be careful with that because women may have a larger stress response to that. But this also is hey, you probably want to utilize things like diet breaks and refeeds and calorie cycling for women in particular, because it can help take off some of that stress of a deficit there. So again, we want to be careful with these strategies, and we want to set up strategies for women that will help them stick to it long term. So again, this is where I come back to things like refeeds may be more helpful for people there. And again, the big thing being, we want to make sure we keep training performance high during a deficit. And that's going to allow us to maintain muscle and potentially build muscle in this process. And this is true, especially the leaner you are. So the leaner you are, you definitely want to make sure that you keep training performance good and that you're pushing training. But the trick's going to be, it's going to be harder to do that. Someone who's overweight and has a lot of body fat, not a lot of muscle, they should be able to, because they have a lot of extra energy on their body, they should be able to maintain training performance pretty well. But the leaner you get, you don't have that. So you really need to make sure training performance is in a good spot, but it also becomes tougher. So you need to be a little bit more strategic around your training there with that. All right. So now I just want to wrap up with just a few diets and why they may work now, right? So again, going through this, you should be able to connect the dots on why certain diets work. So let's first start with intermittent fasting. Why does intermittent fasting work? It cuts out calories. Again, it's going to take that rule of cutting out the time of day. Again, intermittent fasting can also work because it's a form of calorie cycling as well too, if you do a alternate day fasting, right? So again, those are two things there with intermittent fasting. Then we have carnivore diet. Again, this eliminates a large amount of food groups. So again, you're basically eating animal-based foods, high in protein, which high protein is going to increase your thermic effect of food. High fat as well too, with high protein, could also have some satiating effects as well. So again, you can start to see where, okay, now we're cutting that out. That's why that works. For fat loss, keto, same thing. You're cutting out an entire food group, and almost two, right? Because technically real keto is like your high fat, low carb, and moderate protein there, right? So again, you can see where that works. It cuts out an entire food group. Low carb, again, we're going low carb. We're cutting out an entire food group. Vegan diet, we're cutting out food groups, or we're cutting out foods in this process. Again, we talked about aggressive dieting, again, forms of cutting out food and also time that we're eating potentially as well too, depending on that. Paleo diet, same thing. We're emphasizing whole foods. We're we're excluding processed foods, grains, legumes, dairy, stuff like that. Mediterranean diet, same thing. It's emphasizing more healthy foods. I would say that one is a little less if you're going to pick like a quote unquote fad diet, Mediterranean is a great one to use. And intermittent fasting can work too, as long as you're smart about it there. And then like zone diet, again, this is you're counting calories with this one. So again, those are, by going through these, you should have a better idea now of how all these diets work and how they help you. How, again, somebody could go from tracking calories, it's not working, to now I'm going to do keto. And you can see why that could potentially work for some people there. So that's it for this episode. Again, big takeaway. There's more. In order to be in an energy deficit, in order to lose body fat, you need to be in an energy deficit. What makes up energy balance to get you into an energy deficit? Understand that when you get into an energy deficit, or what the inputs that you put in can also impact the energy outside of things. What's most important? Exercise versus nutrition. And then you also know strategies to help us get into that deficit, and then how those strategies paired with, or how, now that you know those strategies, looking at diets, how you know how they can help you people lose weight there. So hope this was helpful. If you found this podcast be helpful in any way, if you could leave a rating and review, and that will help more people find it. If you haven't yet, give me a follow on Jeff. That's where I'm most active on social media. You can ask me any questions, any follow-ups. Hey, you got this wrong. Here's why I think that is. Or, hey, you said this. What the hell does that mean? You can reach out to me there. And then lastly, if you are looking to put all this together, if you are struggling to get into a calorie deficit, or you want to lose a little body fat, or hey, summer's coming up and you want to get on track with everything, then my free 30-minute strategy calls for you. We'll talk about where you're at, where you want to go, how we can bridge that gap to get there, whether that's working with me or other resources or using something else on there. But you'll leave that call knowing what you need to do moving forward. So if you're interested in that, the link to that is in the show notes. That's it for this episode. I'll chat with you next time.